You have until December 26th to vacate, the notice read, taped to my apartment door on Christmas Eve, my landlord's signature scrawled at the bottom like an afterthought. I stood in the hallway in my socks, holiday lights still blinking from my neighbor's door down the hall, and read it twice before the anger fully landed. 2 days later, sitting in the county records office trying to understand my legal options, I found something in the property file that made the clerk actually stop typing and look up at me. The deed on record for that building didn't have my landlord's name on it at all. It had mine. But to understand how a 5-year tenant could legally own the building she was being evicted from, without ever once knowing it, you need to go back 9 years, to a grandfather I barely got to say goodbye to. My name is Ava Bennett Cole. I'm 31, and I work as a title researcher for a regional real estate firm. The kind of unglamorous but detail-obsessed job that involves spending most of my working hours tracing property ownership histories through decades of public records, looking for exactly the kinds of gaps, errors, and irregularities most people never think to check. I moved into apartment 4B of a mid-sized building on Larkspur Avenue 5 years ago, back when I was still finishing my certification and needed something affordable close to the county offices where I trained. My landlord, a man named Frank Doyle, managed the building himself, along with what he described as a small handful of other rental properties around the city. He was gruff, businesslike, occasionally difficult about maintenance requests. But nothing about our landlord-tenant relationship over 5 years ever struck me as unusual. I want to be honest that I never once thought to research the ownership history of my own building, despite doing exactly that kind of research professionally, for other properties, nearly every day. It simply never occurred to me. Sometimes the thing closest to you is the thing you examine least carefully. My grandfather, Walter Bennett, died 9 years ago when I was 22 and finishing my undergraduate degree. He'd been a quiet, careful man, a retired civil engineer who'd spent much of his later years investing modestly in small rental properties around the city. The kind of unglamorous, steady real estate investment that never made him wealthy exactly, but gave him a comfortable, independent retirement. I want to be honest that my family's relationship with my grandfather, in his final years, was complicated in ways that matter for this story. My mother and her siblings had a strained relationship with him, rooted in old family disputes I only partially understood growing up. Disputes that meant we saw him only occasionally, mostly around holidays, rather than with the closeness some grandchildren have. When he passed, his estate was handled by an attorney my family had never met before, a man named Elliot Marsh, who my mother later described as someone my grandfather had apparently started using in his final 2 years, after a falling out with the family's longtime estate attorney over reasons nobody in the family ever fully clarified for me. The estate settlement, as it was explained to my family at the time, was modest. A house, sold and divided among my mother and her 2 siblings, some savings accounts. My family was told, at the time, that my grandfather's rental properties had been sold in the 2 years before his death to cover mounting medical expenses related to a prolonged illness, leaving comparatively little in actual real estate assets by the time he passed. I want to be honest that nobody in my family questioned this explanation closely at the time. We were grieving, somewhat estranged from him already, and Elliot Marsh presented the settlement with the kind of confident, thorough paperwork that discourages the average grieving family member from digging deeper into details that seem, on their face, straightforward. I certainly never connected any of this. At 22 years old, 3 years before I even moved into apartment 4B, to the building I would eventually come to live in myself. I want to walk through what actually happened in the days immediately following that eviction notice, because the timeline matters enormously. The stated reason for the eviction, according to Frank, was that he intended to sell the building to a developer interested in converting it to condominiums, and needed all units vacated within an unusually short window to finalize the sale before year's end, apparently for tax reasons on his side. I want to be honest that even setting aside everything I discovered afterward, a Christmas Eve eviction notice with a 2-day vacate window was almost certainly not legally enforceable on its own, regardless of any underlying ownership question. Standard tenant protection law in our state requires substantially longer notice periods for this kind of termination, something Frank, after 5 years as my landlord, should have known perfectly well. That alone was what sent me to the county records office 2 days later. Not suspicion about ownership, simply an intention to pull our state's standard tenant protection statutes alongside the building's basic property file. The same routine research I performed for other properties nearly every week professionally. I want to describe the moment itself, because I've replayed it many times since. I pulled the property file for 214 Larkspur Avenue expecting to see Frank Doyle's name as recorded owner, purely as a formality before moving on to the tenant protection statutes I'd actually come in for. Instead, the deed of record, filed just over 8 years earlier, listed the owner as Ava Marie Bennett Cole. My name. My actual legal name, correctly spelled, correctly matched to my date of birth once I pulled the accompanying probate transfer documentation. I sat there in the records office for what the clerk later told me was nearly 20 minutes, simply staring at a screen that made no immediate sense against anything I understood about my own life. What the accompanying probate documents revealed, once I traced them carefully using exactly the professional research methods I use every day for other people's property disputes, was this. My grandfather, in the final year of his life, had not sold his rental properties to cover medical expenses at all. He had, through Elliot Marsh, restructured ownership of several properties, including 214 Larkspur Avenue, into a testamentary trust naming me specifically as beneficiary to take effect upon his death, separate entirely from the general estate my mother and her siblings had been told constituted his full remaining assets. I don't know, and may never fully know, why my grandfather chose to leave this particular property specifically to me, rather than folding it into the general estate my mother and her siblings inherited. I have theories, based on fragments of family history I've since pieced together, involving old resentments between him and my mother that never fully healed before he died, and a particular fondness he apparently held for me specifically, the grandchild who saw him least often, but who, according to my mother, he'd occasionally mentioned wanting to make sure was taken care of properly in his final years. What matters more immediately, for understanding what happened next, is what Frank Doyle apparently did with this information once he discovered it. Elliot Marsh, it turned out, based on records I traced over the following weeks working alongside an attorney I retained once the scale of this became clear, had a prior business relationship with Frank Doyle extending back several years before my grandfather's death, a relationship involving property management services Frank had provided for several of my grandfather's other rental holdings. Rather than properly notifying me, the actual beneficiary, of the trust transfer following my grandfather's death, Elliot Marsh and Frank Doyle appear to have quietly continued operating 214 Larkspur Avenue exactly as though ownership remained unchanged, with Frank simply continuing to collect rent from all 6 units in the building, including, eventually, from me, as though he remained the legitimate owner and landlord throughout. I want to be careful here about what I can and cannot prove with certainty. What the documented paper trail clearly shows is that the deed transferred to me legally 8 years ago. What remains under ongoing legal investigation, as of this recording, is the precise mechanism by which I was never formally notified of that transfer, and the extent to which Frank Doyle and Elliot Marsh coordinated to conceal it deliberately, rather than it resulting from some more innocent administrative failure. I want to be honest that the emotional weight of this discovery took me considerably longer to process than the legal and financial implications, which professionally I understood almost immediately. For 8 years, I had unknowingly paid rent, totaling just over $96,000 across 5 years as a tenant myself, to a man who had no legitimate ownership claim to collect it, in a building that had legally, quietly, belonged to me the entire time. For 3 of those 8 years, before I even moved in, Frank had apparently collected rent from the building's other 5 units as well, income that, based on the trust documentation, should have been directed to me as beneficiary from the moment my grandfather passed. I retained a real estate litigation attorney, Miriam Castellano, Within the same week, I discovered the deed. Bringing with me documentation I'd already begun compiling using my professional research skills before I'd even fully processed what I was looking at personally rather than professionally. Miriam moved quickly, filing for immediate legal ownership confirmation and an emergency injunction halting the attempted eviction entirely. Given that Frank held no legitimate legal standing to evict a tenant from a building he did not, in fact, own, the eviction notice, unsurprisingly, was voided within days once filed with the court alongside the recorded deed. Frank's attempted sale to the condominium developer collapsed immediately, since he had never possessed legitimate ownership to sell in the first place. The accounting process that followed, reconstructing 8 years of rental income Frank had collected across all 6 units of a building he didn't own, took the better part of a year to fully resolve. The eventual settlement, reached before the case proceeded to full trial, required Frank to repay just over $410,000 in wrongfully collected rental income, along with legal costs, based on a careful accounting Miriam's team constructed using building records, my own tenant payment history, and testimony from several of the building's other longtime tenants once they learned what had actually happened. Elliot Marsh, facing separate scrutiny from the state bar regarding his handling of my grandfather's estate, surrendered his law license before formal disciplinary proceedings concluded, a resolution that spared him criminal prosecution but ended his legal career entirely. I want to be honest about where things stand with my own family now because I think it matters. My mother, upon learning what my grandfather had done, quietly without ever telling her, initially struggled with complicated feelings I understood, but couldn't entirely resolve for her. She has, over the months since, come to a kind of peace with it, framing it, in her own words, as the last conversation he never got to have with me, said through paperwork instead. I now formally own 214 Larkspur Avenue outright. The building I once rented an apartment in, now legally, fully mine, along with the accumulated income Frank was ordered to repay. I've kept the building running as a rental property, with considerably more attentive, transparent management than it apparently received for nearly a decade beforehand. I think about my grandfather often now, a man I genuinely didn't know as well as I wish I had, understanding that in his final year, quietly, carefully, using exactly the kind of thorough paperwork instinct I apparently inherited from him professionally, he tried to make sure I was taken care of, in a way that took 8 years and an attempted Christmas Eve eviction to finally come to light. Sometimes inheritance doesn't arrive the way you expect it to, wrapped neatly and explained clearly at a family meeting. Sometimes it sits quietly in a public record for years, waiting for exactly the wrong kind of person to overreach badly enough that someone finally goes looking. If you've made it this far with me, do you think Elliot Marsh acted alone in concealing this? Or do you think there are other properties out there like mine, still waiting to be discovered? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this one matter to you, make sure you're subscribed to Justice Unfolds, because every story here has a reckoning.